What's up, weirdos? We all know about the Salem witch trials that caused a mass hysteria in New England around 1692. Well, this isn't about that. This episode is about an event that happened during another mass hysteria, one that involved vampires in New England, around 200 years after the Salem witch trials. This is the story of the Mercy Brown vampire incident. Mercy Lena Brown was known as the last American vampire, whose story takes place in Exeter, Rhode Island. But the story doesn't begin with her. It begins with her brother. Edwin Brown had just returned to Exeter from Colorado, where he was in search for a cure to a mysterious illness that was contracted by him and his family. They all had been exhibiting symptoms of rapid weight loss, trouble breathing, weakness, and coughing up blood. Edwin had been experiencing all of these symptoms for 2 whole years before returning home with mineral water from the Centennial State, but to no avail. All the symptoms persisted. He watched his family die one by one: his father George, his mother Mary, and his sisters Mary Olive and Mercy. That is one more version of the Jetsons opening. Now, doctors couldn't determine the cause of the Brown symptoms, so naturally the townspeople turned to superstition and the supernatural as a last-ditch effort to save the last of the Brown family. Now, this was all during the vampire hysteria, so the women of the Brown family were accused of being vampires, spending their nights emerging from their graves to suck the life out of Edwin from a place between heaven and hell where they were caught. Scratch sexism off your history bingo card. To the townspeople, that meant the cure lay within the bodies of the departed women. Now, at first, Edwin didn't buy into the vampire theory, but desperation eventually took over, and on March 17, 1892, he allowed a band of his relatives and neighbors to exhume the bodies of his mother and sisters. Because nothing says Happy St. Paddy's Day like a family grave digging. And when they opened the caskets of Mary and Mary Olive, all they found were bones. But when they got to Mercy Brown's grave, they found something different. Her body was fully intact, her face flush, her hair and nails appeared to have grown. She was laying on her side instead of her back, and her heart was full of blood. Now, Mercy had only died 8 weeks prior to being dug up, and Dr. Harold Metcalf, a local physician, explained that the fresh state of her body was completely normal, especially for how cold the climate was in that region. But that wasn't enough to convince the people of Exeter. Well, they doubled down on their suspicion and declared Mercy Brown to have been a vampire, because that's what you do when medicine hits a speed bump. Scratch science denial off of your history bingo card. So now that they found the vampire, what about tending to Edwin and his ailments? Well, they cut out Mercy's heart and lungs and cremated them in a nearby bonfire. They then added water to the ashes to make a cocktail for Edwin Brown to drink. This was sure to cure him. Edwin died 2 months later. Now, after all that, Mercy's body was then buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery under an eroded tombstone. Despite that ash cocktail failing, it was still believed that Mercy Brown's alleged vampirism was not only the cause of Edwin's death, but for the demise of his entire family. So much for resting in peace. So, when we look back at the scientific explanation of the story, we now know what wiped out the Browns. It turns out they all had tuberculosis, then referred to as consumption, a disease in which very little was known or understood back then, which was why it was very hard to diagnose. It was also highly contagious, which is why it spread so rapidly throughout the Brown family. It was also the leading cause of death in New England in the 18th and 19th centuries, which placated the cases within the vampire capital of America between 1870 and 1900. As far as Mercy Brown's body goes, Dr. Metcalf was right. It is common for corpses to have somewhat of a fresh-looking state less than 2 months after death. And as the skin loses moisture, it recedes, which gives the impression of elongated fingernails and hair. Now, if Mercy Brown's story seemed a bit familiar to you, you might be reminded of a scene in A Little Story by a man named Bram Stoker. Written in 1897, just 5 years after the Mercy Brown incident, Dracula features a famous scene that includes elements from this story and from the vampire hysteria. It was even reported that after the author's death, Newspaper articles of Mercy Brown were found within his files, which provides some validity to the theory that the legendary author indeed took inspiration from the story. Now, Bram Stoker wasn't the only one who felt inspired by the events in Exeter. Tourists come to the cemetery to visit Mercy Brown's grave and pay respects by leaving plastic vampire teeth and jewelry at her tombstone. The tale of the last American vampire is as compelling as it is cautionary. While it is important to nurse the sick, probably not a great idea to resort to drastic measures, such as assuming people to be undead. It was a wild time then, and there are more stories to come out of it, but none will be remembered like Mercy's.